Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our MBSE podcast. Today, we will have an episode which I guess many of you have waited for a long time, because today we will have a talk about the first methodology. And as Tim is author of a methodology, we will take Sysmod and its companions Vamos
many of you have waited for a long
and
time.
FAS. Sorry, I have to... okay, great. I heard myself, so I had to mute myself. So, okay, we are talking about Sysmod and Vamos and FAS and what these three things are and how they are related. And therefore, yeah, Tim, maybe we can start directly with the first question. What is a methodology?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. And as for many terms in systems engineering, it seems to be simple at the first view, but it isn't. So there are many terms around methodology. You have methodology, method, and process, and tasks. So there are many terms that are often used synonymously, but there aren't. So personally, I like the definition from James Martin, which he provides in his book, Systems Engineering Guidebook, a process for developing systems and products from 1996. That's also the definition Jeff Estefan used in his paper about the MBSE methodologies. That's a quite famous paper. It's freely available. If you Google it, Jeff Estefan, MBSE methodologies, he gave an overview about MBSE methodologies, but it's quite old. And in the introduction chapter, he also defined methodology in other terms using James Martin's definitions. And well, I have to read this to be correct. So James Martin defines a methodology as a collection of related processes, methods, and tools. So processes and methods are no synonyms for methodology. They have different meanings. So a methodology is this collection. And now, according to James Martin, a process is a logical sequence of tasks performed to achieve a particular objective. So, for example, a requirements engineering process or a system architecting process, a validation process, and so on. And a method describes the techniques to perform a task. So in a requirements engineering process, you could have a task to define use cases. And then you can apply a use case method, how to do it. And finally, a part of the definition of a methodology was the term tool. It's a related processes, methods, and tools. And a tool is it's just a thing, an instrument that applied to a method can enhance the efficiency of the task. So you can do use case analysis with a pen as a tool or with a system and modeling tool and so on. So that's the tool.
Okay. Yeah, and I think this is very, very important for many people who are starting with systems engineering to exactly understand this difference. And for me, a process is something that you want to make repeatable. And something which is connected to roles and or to people who are performing these roles with certain methods. Yeah. Great. Cool.
And I think it's important that a methodology is a collection, so it's more like a toolbox. The methodology itself is not a strict process. It's a toolbox that contains processes and other things.
Yeah. And there is also much literature about PMT in general. So if you want to know more about methodologies, you can also Google for PMT very often and you will find something. Okay, so today we want to speak about one certain methodology called Sysmod and Vamos and FAS. And Tim, how are they related to each other?
So Sysmod is an MBSE methodology. And it's mainly used for requirements engineering, system architecting, so the main technical processes in systems engineering. And in addition, it also contains some methods for the adoption of MBSE, and it also considers consulting and training and the setup of the technical MBSE environment, things like that. But the main part is requirements engineering and system architecting. So that's SysMod. VAMOS stands for Variant Modeling with SysML, and well, that one is only a method, so it's not a full methodology that describes how to model variability with SysML, independent of any specific product line engineering tool. That was one of the main objectives of VAMOS, to have an approach purely based on the SysML standard and OCL, which is so to say part of SysML. And VAMOS is defined in the context of SysMod. So concretely, there's a SysMod profile available, and part of the profile are the VAMOS stereotypes, but they are independent of each other. So that's and the third one was FAS.
Correct.
FAS stands for Functional Architectures for Systems. That's a method. So it's also not a methodology. It's only a method for deriving a functional architecture from use cases representing the functional requirements. And I found this method together with Jesko Lam around more than 10 years ago.
Wow.
And we published it in the Systems Engineering Journal from Wiley, and the current version is published in our book, Model-Based System Architecture.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we now know about the methods, and we know we have to implement it in processes to get it running. But what about the tools? Is it bound to a specific tool?
No, they are not bound to a specific tool. Of course, it's good to use a SysML modeling tool for them. So they are, or at least SysMod is independent of SysML. Of course, it fits very well to SysML. So at least you need a SysML modeling tool, and a modeling tool which is almost conform to the standard. But it's not specific then to any of the tools. Nevertheless, as of today, there are plugins available and containing the profiles for some modeling tools, but they are only for the convenience. So if you use a SysML modeling tool which is conform to the standard and allows profiles and stereotypes, you can easily define the profiles yourself. It's a pure SysML modeling task. So it's no need to do some programming or so. And well, defining your profiles yourself is a very good idea. And in any case, you should customize the methodology. So you cannot use SysMod, VAMOS, FAS, or any other methodology out of the box. Maybe only at the beginning as a starting point, but in the end, you must customize the task to your specific needs. And then you need your own profile.
Okay. Yeah, also a very important point, which from my point of view is sometimes the blocking element for the adoption of systems engineering for many companies, because for having your own profile you have to have much knowledge about systems engineering in general, about methods, and about the SysML and the profiling mechanism. Yeah,
and only a few persons must know the profile mechanism. Not every modeler must know it. But interestingly, there's very less information available how to do this. Of course, you find in some SysML or it's pure UML stuff in UML books how to define stereotypes, but you must know the meta model behind it. And I think it's only documented in the specification, and the specification is not a good document to read. It's the specification. So there are no teaching books, no trainings available how to do profiling, but everyone needs it.
Okay. Yeah, totally correct. And we will go into the meta model a little bit deeper in a follow-up question. But first of all, you said FAS is more than 10 years old. When and how did you invent the SysMod?
Yeah, SysMod is about 20 years old, I think. Yeah, around. And but I don't see myself as an inventor of SysMod. I'm more the editor or orchestrator also of it, because SysMod contains lots and lots of methods that are very common. So I'm not the inventor of use case methods and so on. So in detail, I have fine-tuned it so that everything fits well together. And I also did the mapping to SysML, or the detailed mapping to SysML. But in general, it's a set of common methods. Yeah, and I did this around 20 years ago, and it's based on the methods based on the UML and software engineering during that time. They were quite famous. And I have transferred them to systems and to SysML.
Oh,
and
okay.
well, since then, SysMod has developed further, of course, but the core is very stable, so it's quite the same than 20 years ago.
Okay, I really didn't know that it has a UML history. Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so it was 20 years. It's 2001 or 2002. So during that time, I was already a consultant and trainer for modeling, and during that time UML, so SysML was not invented yet. And most of my customers did UML modeling for software engineering, but I also had some customers, they used UML for business processes.
Mm-hmm.
And I had some customers that do processes independent of software. They would just like to describe their business processes or production processes. And I had some customers that would like to use the common UML methodologies during that time. That was methodologies based on UML to describe systems. So I remember a customer who would like to describe harbor equipment,
Mm-hmm.
so cranes, etc., with UML.
Okay.
And it worked very well. And then in 2003, we started with SysML in the OMG to develop it. And during the development of SysML, I created SysMod, because I tried to adapt the SysML language we developed on an example. And at the end, the team had developed SysML, and I had developed SysMod.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so SysMod is very much, if I remember correctly, it's very much about describing the context and an architecture. But looking on the architecture side, we also have the functional view of a system. And FUS is a method for exactly this aspect or view of the system. But what was the reason to invent an own method for that?
Yeah, so SysMod does not contain functional architectures. In SysMod, the architecture is a physical architecture. But it's, so to say, a side way in SysMod. Instead of going directly from the functional analysis use cases to the physical architecture, you can go to the functional architecture and then to the physical architecture. And well, functional architectures or functions they're quite important. No? They are the most important things of a system. That's why we build the system, to get the functionality. No? We build a car to move people or to move things, no? And not because it's nice. No? For some people, it's just because it's nice. No? So functions are important, so it makes sense to focus on them. But typically, requirements engineers have a focus on functions when they elaborate functional requirements and so. But the architects, they have a focus on the architecture, so on the technical stuff. And speaking of SysML also, they look on the block diagrams, and they do not have a focus on activity diagrams, sometimes a bit on state machines and so, but their main focus is on the pure structural stuff. So the idea was to put a focus on the functions for the architects, and well, that was one of the main motivations, I would say. And the other motivation was in the architecture world to strictly separate the more stable functional part from the more unstable technical part. In particular, in the last years, technology changes very fast, while functions are still very stable. So a very illustrative, simple example is I very often daily use the function listen to music. And I do this since 40 years or so or longer. And
I guess nearly 50 years. You had a birthday last week or the week before.
I don't know if I started as a baby. Maybe.
Not actively, I guess.
But the first physical solution was probably a cassette player or a record player. And then I remember in the 1980s, a CD player with Dire Straits and so, and then MP3 player, and now I use streaming services. Even the business models has changed, but the function is still the same. So, of course, there are more functions now in the streaming service than in the cassette player, but so it's a little bit simplified, but very illustrative and shows the point. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like the example I once learned in a training with, or was it a training or was it a speech, a presentation from you with the Coca-Cola machine, where you also have basic functionalities which didn't change over the years. It still cools the drink. It still you have to pay the drink. The technology for paying the drink is different from now to the 50s or 60s or 70s or 80s, where you only had the possibility to pay with coins. Now you can also pay with credit card or by NFC with your watch or your mobile phone and so on. But the basic functionality, pay for the drink, is still the same. Pay for the beverage.
Yeah, and we have more and more a decoupling of functions and the hardware or the physical parts. So they were much closer in the past. So simply said, in the past it was a one-to-one relationship. I have one function and one physical thing to implement it. And now it's more decoupled. And if we still focus on the pure physical things, we have no focus on the functions anymore, and then we get problems. Now we optimize the physical part without knowing the impact on the functions.
Yeah. Function is a good point. So in FAS, you modeled the function as a block. And my question would be, why not modeling as an activity, as activity inherits from structural and behavioral metaclasses?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, we have two kind of functions, so to say. We have the function in the problem space, and that function is still represented by an activity as a part of the use case model. So there we use activities. And basically, we could also use the activities in the solution space, so in the architecture world. Because in SysML, the activity model element can be depicted on a block definition diagram. That's possible. You can show relationships between activities, so composite relationships also. But you cannot show the object flow. So you cannot show the parameters of the activity in the block definition diagram, and you cannot connect them. And that's what you would like to see. Simply said, the architecture view, boxes, interfaces, and connections. And so that's not possible with an activity. So we need the block for that. So we pick the block, the functional block, and the functional block represents a set of related functions. And the functional block gets ports depicting the functional interfaces, and in the internal block diagram we can connect all this stuff.
Yeah, correct.
And another reason is the functional block is, the semantics of the functional block does not fit to the semantics of an activity. An activity is a behavioral element and shows the sequencing of actions, and the functional block is more a set of related functions. So all functions that can process audio signals also are in that block.
Yeah,
So
and
not a sequence, so a complete sequence.
Yeah. But if you want to give it a behavior, you can still put a behavior diagram on it.
Yeah.
And
a block can own behaviors.
Exactly.
So it can own the activity diagrams. Then that's possible if you would like to have that. Yeah. And well, you said you listened to a speech or training. So did you use FAS by yourself?
Indeed, I did. It was more or less in the beginning of my systems engineering career, when I had an OSE training with, I guess it was Stefan Roth.
Yeah.
And I was very impressed about his knowledge of the UML meta model, and everything was new for me, and it was really interesting. But besides the whole SysML stuff, we had a big focus on the method, on the FAS method in this training, and it was very valuable or it was my moment in my life where I first understood what a systems engineering method does. We had this example of the forest fire detection system.
Yes, FFDS.
And it was extremely interesting because you go through these steps, these method steps, and we created a functional architecture where we saw something can't be right. So we had many is it functional flows or something? Many flows between the functional architecture, and it didn't seem to be right. And so we went back one step, and we followed the instructions again for this one step. And then we saw, oh wow, now we get an architecture which is on the one hand simple, on the other hand straightforward. Not so many interconnections between the different functional blocks, and it was very interesting to do that. And that was my first impression of FAS.
Yeah, I had a similar experience in a real project that was also quite interesting. So we did use case analysis, and then the plan was to derive the functional architecture. And in the workshop there were requirements engineers and system architects together. So and first we started with the use cases, and the system architects, for them it was a little bit boring. It's not their world. It's not block diagrams. No, it's flow diagrams, activities. And of course they said things, nice and correct, and but there was no energy there. And then we used the FAS plugin that was developed by the GFSE working group. And with the FAS plugin, you can create the first version of the functional architecture more or less automatically. Of course, you have to do some steps, but they create it automatically. So we did that, so bang, and we had the functional architecture, and then the architects, no, there's something wrong. That cannot be true. So this architect gut feeling, they see this pattern of an architecture and see there's something wrong. And then they analyzed it when there's a lot of traceability, and we could trace it back, and there was an error then in the use case model. But they had not seen that before because, well, that's not their word. And their gut feeling does not work in the use case world, but it works in the architecture world. So it was quite interesting.
Okay, cool. Good story. So I guess it was interesting for both sides.
Yes.
That defining use cases is important, but you can do shitty stuff in this stage, and if you can't trace it back, you will even have a bad functional architecture, or you will have some change in a later phase, which is very expensive regularly.
Right. Yeah. So it's quite a nice method, and it's easy to apply in workshops, even for people who have no modeling knowledge. You can do this with cards and so on. It works very well. I did this also on conferences in 4-hour workshops or so. We created from the beginning of a system idea until the functional architecture. We were able to do this in 4 hours or so. Of course, very simplified over it. But it works without modeling knowledge.
Yeah.
So, but if you model it, then of course it gets a little bit complicated. If you use the plugins, then a lot of that stuff is behind the scenes in the scripts. But if you have to do this completely yourself, it's a lot of modeling, because it's not directly supported by SysML. And SysML does not know the concept of functional architecture. Yeah. So SysML does not know the concept of system contexts. And so if you want to model those things, then you have sometimes to do a lot of things, so do a lot of modeling. So the modeling could be very hard, and if you're not so experienced with modeling, then it distracts you from the real interesting engineering stuff, and you're focused on the SysML hurdles, and so that's probably a disadvantage.
Yeah, but everything you said in the last sentences is also true for variant modeling. And so
interesting topic.
Yeah, let's switch to Wemos. Basically, Wemos addresses another missing piece besides functional architecture, system context, and so on, and in a missing piece in the SysML, so to say. And with Wemos, you invented a method to make it possible to model variability in UML and SysML, right?
Yes, right. So SysML version 1, I must say.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, nowadays we have to say SysML version 1. Yeah.
Version 1 does not have explicit model elements for variants. That's not part of the language. And I remember that we discussed that variant modeling issue when we developed SysML version 1 now 20 years ago. So the idea was to create a modeling language, a systems modeling language, as simple as possible for various reasons. So that was the reason why we did not explicitly include variant modeling to the language. And at the same time, it was clear for us that you can do modeling variants with SysML. It's possible to do that, although there's no explicit model element. But you can do this mainly with the generalization relationship. It's a kind of it's a core variant modeling relationship, so to say. But we explicitly excluded it from the language. Otherwise, well, then we also had to include safety, which is important, and other things. And then, it would have cost more years to develop SysML, and it's a very large language, and then you need tools that implement it, and all this problem. So it was intended to have a simple modeling language. And then, well, SysML was published, the project started using SysML, and of course the question came up, well, how to model variants of SysML? And then people say, well, use the generalization relationship, but how to use it, and how to model a variation point, and how to do this and this and that, and how to model variant constraints, like exclusive OR of two variants or requires. And there's a constraint relationship in SysML, you can use that one, but how to do this. And that was the idea of the Wemos approach, to show how to do variant modeling with pure SysML, so including stereotypes, but there's no need for a specific tool. So you can define variation points, variants, variant constraints, all this stuff.
And configurations in the end.
And configurations, and I also developed the OCL statements behind the constraints, so these exclusive OR, and so you can create a variant configuration in the model, and if the tool can execute the OCL constraints, the model can check if it's a valid configuration or not. So you have this variant configuration inside the modeling tool based on pure standards. So that's quite nice, but variant modeling is a very complex thing. That's a multi-dimensional configuration space. So it's an inherent complex thing. And if you now use a modeling tool that has no convenience functions for that, that just uses the stereotypes from Wamos, then you have a limit there. So if it's getting too complex, then it's really hard to manage those models in the SysML modeling tool.
Okay. Did you ever use it in another SysML tool outside Cameo Systems Modeler?
Yeah, also in with Enterprise Architect, but without the OCL stuff.
Okay.
So the OCL statements are not executed, but the description of the variants is possible with Enterprise Architect, and I think also with Rhapsody.
Okay. Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I think a few weeks ago, Willard Software Tools published the Wamos profile for Rhapsody. I think it's in their blog, but I'm not sure. Correctly.
Yeah, we can look it up and put it in the episode description if we find it.
Yeah, and in another project, we combined parts of the Wamos approach with Pure Systems. So with the tool, the Pure Systems tool.
Pure Variants.
Pure Variants, yeah. And the similar tool is from Big Lever. I don't
Gears.
Know if the same name. Gears, yes, Gears, right. So they can manage the feature model and they can manage the configurations, but they do not contain the capability to model the configuration model. So you can do the configuration model with the Wamos approach, but manage then the configurations with Pure Variants, for example.
Okay. Yeah, it reminds me
can combine it.
Reminds me of that we really should invite Danilo Beuche in our podcast because he can tell us very, very much about product line engineering, feature-oriented domain analysis, and so on and so further.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, but speaking of variation points and variants and everything Wamos brings with it, this is already included in SysML v2, isn't it? So is there still a need for Wamos later on?
Well, I have not analyzed that in detail. So SysML v2 will contain variant concepts based on the ISO standard. And there are 4 variant concepts that should be part of the language: variation point, variant, variation, variant binding, if I remember it correctly. So the core concepts of variant modeling. So not all concepts of Wamos are covered by SysML v2. So I assume that I will create an update on how Wamos looks like with SysML v2, especially to support the migration from SysML v1 to SysML v2 models which use Wamos. But most parts of the current Wamos, I think, is then obsolete in the future. And in the long term, I would then focus more on the variant modeling methods in Wamos. So Wamos is now more language, or language extension, and the definition of the variant concepts, and not so much a method. So I think it will focus then more on the method. For example, there's a new interesting upcoming discipline, model-based product line engineering, MBPLE, which, well, it's product line engineering with models. And I think there's a lot of space to define more methods or so. So I think that's the future of Wamos.
Okay, interesting. All right, so I think we are through with Sysmod, Wamos, and FAS with the basic concepts. Who wants to know more, we will link all the books which were published from Tim to all these topics. And if you want a training, you can directly go to OSE and ask them for consultancy and training. And if you enjoyed this episode, give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel for free here on YouTube to not miss out any future episode. Yeah.
Future episode. What's the next episode?
That's a good question. Can you answer it? I can't.
Yeah, no. I know that we look for, or we are in contact with the company InkQuery, a very interesting company, but we plan an episode with them in October, November or so. Currently look for a date. But we will definitely do an episode before October, November. And well, no, we have not defined it yet. So
Yeah,
have to do
so
that.
if you, our listeners, have an idea, let's give us a hint in the comments, in the comment section, what you want to hear about. Maybe it's a little bit an update of SysML v2, because there we are nearly at the final submission, or other topics around systems engineering. If not, we have a long list of speakers who should be invited by us soon, and topics. So this should not be the end of the podcast here. Yeah, Tim, was nice to speak to you. It was even nicer to speak to you in person on Monday in Switzerland.
Yes, that was a great conference, the SwissEd.
Absolutely.
Perfect.
And great weather directly on the Zurich Sea, on the Zurich Lake. Was a great conference, definitely. Okay, so thanks for listening, and do not forget,
trust us.
We are
systems engineers.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.